Good morning. I was slightly dreading this as a consequence to the absence, or my absence, particularly in this very important course and argument about attaching and connecting a thought to an action, phenomena to event, violence to culture. And look at this. Suddenly this is revealed. It's quite nice. It's my library, and here I am sitting ready to begin the first in a series of conversations or thoughts about Hannah Arendt and her essay on violence. The essay is difficult, and so this perhaps is a way forward into the last 4 years of an investigation into a specific, very difficult, convoluted, idealistic, complex argument around violence. Provocative, because it's Arendt, and why Arendt? Well, Arendt is performative. And in thinking about the construction of this talk this morning, I was thinking about how does one, there's something about my own personal infatuation with the German Jewish exile philosopher, sunglasses, cigarette, talking, in a kind of particular embodiment, in a particular kind of a rapture of thought, allowing philosophy to exist alongside the exchange and the performance. I mean, this would be Arendt. There are YouTube clips which beautifully portray this. That might come up again. So Arendt is attractive because Arendt is performative. Arendt is attractive because Arendt has a legacy of text and is a key philosopher around action and thought. And makes a very strong argument about distance because she experienced distance, because of her own exile. She's able to see the world from a distance, and makes this very strong argument that consciousness or ideas or meaning or philosophy arrives at distance, that once one begins to see a plane, a universe, the other, as a possibility of exchange, then there is distance, and then there is consciousness. Arendt is a man does not exist alone, and therefore is a positivist, but a very complicated one because of her time and place. So there is violence in her. She is surrounded by violence. She has seen violence. She has seen rupture. She has seen it at its most radical at the most radical moment that violence could present itself. At that particular time, there is violence, there is Arendt. Arendt is habiting it, and Arendt is then doing violence to thought, because then Arendt goes off to America and starts to challenge thought at a very important time of American philosophical enlightenment. So in the 60s, 1968, with many essays, many thoughts. From the 40s, thoughts about outsiders, nationalism, racism, totalitarianism, control. This text comes out with a collection of essays, and it is called Crisis of the Republic. Now, what's interesting is that I have done violence, sadly, to this wonderful first edition, trudging it back to the university year after year, in an attempt to understand and interplay this with this little play, Antigone, because they talk directly to each other, like a sandwich. One can think about what one could have in between these two texts as an interplay. And how do we find that conversation? That's a very important point. And if one can start to have that conversation, if one can start to have a conversation with text onto text, one starts to become critical. One sees the possibilities. Because there are multiple interpretations of this text. This text has become canonized as a text for humanity, and a political text, and an interpretive text, and an adapted text, and a multicultural text, and a intercultural text. It is a key text, and it can then have all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of opinions, all sorts of ideas that present it as a planet in that Eleanor Fuchs way. And alongside this is this essay, Crisis of the Republic. So this will no longer travel. Now it will be re-preserved in the library, because this is ridiculous. There is, I can no longer treat my books this way. This is violent. And it is also about the institution, which is what makes the course again so interesting, because if we bring in the other theory and the other theorists, it's about how do we maintain order through a particular inherence of violence, the phenomena of violence. I mean, the study of violence is not unique to South Africa, but if we have so much of it, then let us study it. It is a commodity. Violence is a commodity in post-apartheid South Africa. So these recordings will try and get through the essay primarily with some digression. That is the key idea, is to literally attempt to break the pattern of kind of exclusivity in the essay. Here's Arendt, the other part of the rapture, the other part of the break. So you see, there is something underlying the course, and this probably comes up with text and the investigation of adaptation as violence, and to locate the positivism in violence, which is what Arendt does attempt to do in this essay. That in this essay, she is suggesting that revolutions need to happen, and they are positive. And no matter that they are violent, they will produce positive change. And she looks at examples, and she writes this at the time of that 1968 moment, which has a very strong influence on intellectualism. these reflections, and I think that's very important, that how this essay opens as a reflection. It is just a reflection. It is a kind of the lightest thing that one could present onto violence is a reflection. She's not saying the critique of violence, the argument of violence. There is a reflection to violence, and it is provoked by events and debates. So here already we have a very interesting way that Arendt presents and makes use of the unit, the narrative, to present, to suggest everything that comes up. And this is in the provocation, in the event, and the debate, and the last few years. So the reflection is about a thought that then becomes provocative. What happens to a thought that becomes provocative? It is violent. So violence is a thought. A thought can be positive. A thought can produce change. We're talking about change here. We're talking about alterity. We're talking about slippages, breaks, things that happen. Arendt similarly says that thinking is a conversation with the self. And in order to advance the thinking, one needs to recognize the multiple selves and to have those conversations in order to advance the self. And that process of thought is violent because it's an advancement. So the reflection and the provoke are already having a conversation here. This is complicated stuff. But interesting because you can stop. You don't necessarily have to get stuck on the first few lines, and you can stay on the next few lines for the next 4 years. So, provoked by events and debates, and there it is. Reflection, provocation, event, debate. Last few years has to do with history, and particularly the 20th century. As she calls to Lenin, it's a century of wars and revolutions. And violence, in all of this, in the provocation, in the debate, in the event, in the history, in Lenin, in 20th century, is violence. So it is a phenomena, but it is also a connector point. So history then is a thread. This play as history is a thread into that argument. In this play, there is provocation. In this play, there are debates. In this play, there is a genealogy of Oedipus. In this play, there is the political. There is, however, another factor in the present situation which, though predicted by nobody, is of least equal importance. And that is the link, and that is the horror. So it's not only positivism, there is also the hinge to the horror, which is the advancement of the implementation of violence. Because if violence is used to control, then violence can sophisticatedly, using sophisticated implements, control without necessarily us knowing that we have had harm done to us.